prior to me becoming a Christian. John Wesley always spoke about prevenient grace. And that means that when you look back on your life, even before you're a believer, you can identify times in your life that are significant and important. When I was born outside of wedlock, but my mum and dad were married when I was born, if you understand me. And in the days of abortion that we live in today, thankfully in those days, people would have been adopted, but they loved me and they were married for 53 years. And I'm grateful for God giving me life through them and being good parents to me and to my family. And then when I was 13, I was living in Leicester then, I came off my bike in summer holidays and the handlebar went into the side and it caused a dull ache. The following day, it was diagnosed I had appendicitis. I'd had my breakfast, so I couldn't eat for the rest of the day. And about 2 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, I was operated on. And my mum and dad told me after I'd had the operation that within 10 minutes more, I could have had a burst appendix, which I could have died. So I could have died at the age of 13. And a year later, we moved up to Cheadle-Hulme, where my dad had worked for 6 years, and then later on they moved to Cheltenham. So in the context of that, God gave me life. He gave me a good family. They weren't believers. My mum, I believe, had a faith because she taught in Sunday school, but when they got married, they never went to church together as a family. So God broke into my life in 1969. And how he did it is my maths ability when I was in junior school was below average. But 2 years later, the high school teacher thought I was good enough for O-levels, which was a key thing because when we came up here, my dad was able to get me into a boys' grammar school in Cheadle called Moseley Hall. Some of you may know of it. But in that school, the RE teacher was a Christian. And in the autumn term, he invited a Christian man to come in and share his faith in the classroom. He'd written a book of poems. His name was Gordon Bailey. And he and his family were involved in a church which is still there in Heaton Chapel, the Coach House Christian Church. But he came in and he brought Christianity in a very vibrant and live way. And I engaged with it and I enjoyed it. And 2 months later, he was invited to speak at a church in Bramhall called Ford's Lane Evangelical Church. And one of my colleagues in my class went to the church and invited me to come along with the other group. So I did. And I enjoyed hearing him for the two weeks. But I thought, what do I do now? But I thankfully kept going. And I was there at the church for 22 years. So this testimony, my church was Ford's Lane from 1969 to 1991. And then in the last 4 years of this testimony, I was involved with Ivy Cottage in Didsbury and then the beginnings of Hazel Grove Baptist Church, where we are now. So that gives you a bit of a context. So I was studying my O and A-levels at the Hope, and I got them. Not massively big grades, but that doesn't matter. And I started on a course with accountancy at Manchester Poly. So it's been really good doing this because it's made me put down those stages in my life, and I can look back and see turning points on the journey. And I look back in those first 4 years, there were 3 American ministers that came over to England, which I heard. The first one in 1971, I've been a Christian about 2 years, and he was doing a work on the Sunset Strip over in California and helping people come off drugs, coming to Christ, building them up. He was doing very inspiring work, and he came to England. You may remember him. He was called Arthur Blessed. He had a cross, and he, his wife and people, they took it round many towns and cities in this country. And they came to Cheadle. I heard him there and heard him in Plattfields in Manchester. And it gave me the encouragement to share my faith. And that for me was a big thing. So that was important. And then in 1972, there was a One Way for Jesus festival in Manchester, which I went to, and I affirmed my faith. I went forward. And there was a minister there called Stephen Alford. And he had a radio ministry as well. And interestingly, a few years later, my first private client was a Christian charity, which actually raised money to buy radio time for him to have an evening slot. He already had an American charity paying for his morning slot. So that was crucial. And then by 1973, my faith was going quite strong and I wanted to be baptized. So we believed in believers' baptism at Ford's Lane. So I got baptized and gave my testimony before a full church, including my mum and dad. And my mum probably thought she'd lost her son to religion, but she hasn't. And but I just look back now and think, at that point in my life, becoming a Christian just before you start your career, and then you meet the person who's to become your wife, was very, very important. So in 1973, I got baptized on the 11th of March. And as the Bible is very keen to say that 40 is a very important number. Well, 40 days after that baptism night, I went to an Easter youth conference, and it was there on the Good Friday morning. I sat down to this young lady next to me for breakfast, and I've been sitting down for breakfast ever since. And she's obviously my wife of 40 plus years. And but she's been a stalwart and a real help, because as I've gone through my training and my studies, she's been there all the way. And so we were involved with Ford's Lane. I was involved with Sunday school. I was involved in a youth club for children. And when we got married in 1976, it was at the Gospel Hall where she'd gone to in Redcar. And the hymn that I chose for our wedding was the Take My Life and Let It Be. You may know the hymn. It's a hymn of consecration, and we changed the words from singular to plural. Take our lives and let them be. And it's really been a testimony, because that's what I've always wanted to do. I wanted a Christian wife who I can serve Jesus with. And while we're in, for my first 4 years, I was working for a firm in Manchester doing my training. And when we got married in 1976, my training was going to finish in October, but because I'd failed my exams twice, I had more study leave, which meant that I had to have my articles extended to the end of December. And within that time, I retook my final exams, and I thankfully passed. But because of that, God provided the first 3 months of our salary. I wouldn't have had a job, and moved down to Stockport. Took 2 months to get work. So again, that was a time of provision, which we look back on. And God provided me with a job with a firm of accountants at the top of the road, literally 5 minutes. We used to live on Lowfield Road, which I gathered David and his wife lived on a few years later. But we were there for 8 years. So I could walk to work in 5 minutes. And we had an hour and a quarter for lunch, so I could come back and see Anne. And when the girls were young, I could also see them for an hour in the middle of the day. So that was a real blessing. And then Sarah Rachel came along in 1979 and 1980 while we were in Stockport. And life was good and well. And we went to Spring Harvest in 1979 and 1980 when the girls were very young. What I find is that not only my local church was a big help to me, but I learned an awful lot outside my local church. And that was important in my development as a Christian. And when I look back, I found various times where I've shared my faith, and I was able to share my faith in digs, and a couple of the men that I shared my faith with came to our wedding. And when I was working for this firm at the top of the road, and there was a young man there who knew someone else that I knew who was in a Christian rock band at the time, and I was able to share my faith with him. And one summer, before the children had come along, he liked Cliff Richard, and Cliff Richard had just brought out a gospel album at the time, and he came to my house and we had lunch together, and he liked to play it. And at the end of the week, he said, can I ask you a favor, David? And I thought he was going to ask, can I borrow the record? He said, can I borrow a Bible? So I rushed upstairs, got a Bible and a few tracts for him to read, and he took them away. Anyway, a few weeks later, he was giving guitar lessons to a lady in New Mills where he lived. And he told me that she wanted to teach guitar to the Sunday school that she was involved with in New Mills. Anyway, to cut a long story short, I said, well, bring her around for a coffee. And I realized that God was working. And I started a Bible study in our home for them. And that was important because it was a step of faith. And over 3 or 4 years, either side of our 2 homes, it grew to about 15 or 20. And we were able to teach and befriend and help youngsters grow up in the faith. But but in 1984, there was a bit of family sadness because Anne's dad sadly passed away. He'd had asbestosis for a year, and he died in April 1984. And Anne obviously stayed up with her mum, with Sarah and Rachel, who were only 3 and 4 at the time, to be with the mum. So I went up at weekends, and on Sunday night, I waved them off at Darlington, and they waved me off. And I sat next to this lady. It was a crowded train, but it was like God had provided the occasion. And this lady called Jane Shoesmith, I was chatting with her, and just before York, I said that we're Christians and we believe that we will see my father-in-law again because he was a Christian. And it opened up the discussion because she just had some Christian friends and went to this church in Disbury. Anyway, I talked about anything and everything to do with Christianity between York and Manchester Victoria. And at the end of it, I really felt ministered to myself because it wasn't an easy time. But I remember saying to her, I said, if you ever become a Christian, give us a call. And I gave her our family phone number. 6 weeks later, my wife answers the phone, and it was Jane. And she said, I've become a Christian. And a few months later, she was baptized, and we went to that her baptism. And a few years later, we were led to go to Ivy Cottage anyway, and she was there. And so that was a real blessing that I'm very, very grateful for. And then as the 90s progressed, I think it was probably work, doing part-time work as well, having a young family. I must have got tired and exhausted, and I just felt in my spirit a bit worn out. And I just felt the Lord there was something more to do with my faith that I needed. And I knew it was to do with the Holy Spirit. And in 1990, it was the week of July, 1990, the last week of July, was a very poignant one for me because a friend round the corner who we'd become friends with knew this Christian young teacher who was going out to be a missionary, and we went round to chat with them. And after talking with them for a few minutes, he said, is there anything we can pray for? And I just felt me saying, I want to move in power. Well, when you say things like that to God, he answers, doesn't he? Anyway, he prayed over me, and a few days later, my wife and I were at another meeting, similar but with other people, and we were prayed for together. And the following day, we took Rachel and our son Mark at the time to a theme park in Warrington called Gulliver's World. And at the end of the day, I'd just come off the log flume with Rachel and Sarah, met Rachel and Mark, and Rachel asked me, can I go on a slide? And I said, okay. And she comes off the slide, and her body weight takes her to the left or the right. And one of her wrists, she has a green stick fracture. And I thought, oh, what a way to spoil a lovely day. And that was the human part of me coming out. But the previous night, I'd seen something quite significant where God ministered to a certain lady there. And I thought, well, this is just like in the Gospels and the Acts. And she was set free from something. And I thought to myself, well, if God can do that, Rachel's wrist is nothing. And I just asked Rachel to give us her wrist and arm. And I just prayed over it as we were going down the M56 back to Cheadle. Anyway, 15 minutes later, I asked her how her wrist is, and she said it's fine. Well, that was wonderful, wasn't it? But what was even more wonderful was a few weeks later, she was at a birthday party for a friend at the Altrincham ice rink. We weren't with her. We'd went off to friends in Rochdale to have some prayer for something else. But she went, but she came back buzzing because she'd had another green stick fracture. But what she did, because of the faith that came out of the previous meeting, she herself had the faith to believe God for healing, and God healed. So she came in really lifted. And I thought, wow. Well, the following morning we went to church, and one of the elders was speaking from, I think it was Psalm 42. It was the one which has, I am the Lord that healeth thee. And he came to that verse and he just said, we believe that God heals at this church, but we don't do it here. And I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The previous day, I'd been for prayer to do with my epilepsy. Rachel had fallen over and prayed for herself and God had healed. And then you're hearing a leader of the church the following day saying, well, we believe God heals, but we don't do it here. And I thought, this had been my spiritual home for 20 plus years. And I thought, I can't believe that I'm hearing this. And I just sensed in my spirit that the Lord was drawing our time to this church. I've been there 22 years, never even thought of ever leaving. But anyway, the Lord, a couple of other things happened. And I just thought, well, the Lord's got somewhere else for us. And the following Easter, we were coming back from Spring Harvest, and we met someone in a car park in Bala on the way back, just having some lunch. And it was a couple of ladies from Ivy Cottage. And I shared what God was doing in our lives. She said, well, why don't you come to us? We have a healing service the first Saturday of every month. So I came and shared a bit of my testimony, and I knew one or two people there. And God was drawing us to that church. And I just thought, why do you have to go to Spring Harvest once a year just to get a good praise time and a good word? It should be every week. And that's what it gave us. And what was interesting was, because we moved there, and it was right, obviously, to move, that about 3 or 4 months later, I lost my job. 2 months short of being at this firm for 15 years, I was being told he was selling to someone else and someone had to go. And because I'd had a practice certificate myself, he felt I was the one that could make the best of it. Anyway, I just forgave my boss there and then. And that was on the Friday, the 1st of November. But the Saturday following was a healing service, and a lady felt led to give me this verse, and it was Revelation 3:8 that says, I've opened a door that no man can shut, from Revelation. And I just felt God was saying to me, the door is not a door closed in your face, but it's a door that I'm opening. It's a door of opportunity, and it's a door that's still open. It was like my beginnings of my self-employment, and I've been working self-employed for 30 years now. I've been employed for 20 years prior to that, but God was obviously taking me to a different place. And thankfully, because of my faith and because what I was able to hear from what God was saying to me at the time, this was what I believed was the right place. So Ivy Cottage was the right place for us at that time. And the following day, we had that meeting, and then on the following Sunday morning, that verse was given out in the morning, because we had a quiet time of communion at the end of the service, and the elder who was leading that bit used to be in accountancy with me, and we studied together. And he said, someone's here this morning, and he didn't know what had happened to me. He said, someone's here this morning with a testimony to share. Will you please stand up and share it? And he was taken aback when it was me telling him I'd lost my job. But anyway, God was good. So he gave me that verse in the following 2 days of losing my job. And that really began a totally new experience for us, because faith particularly became very important. Every week, you didn't necessarily have a paycheck coming in. It was believing God for money. And sometimes there was nothing, sometimes there was a lot. But it was a totally new area he was bringing us to. And Rachel noticed what had happened in her mum and dad, and she wanted the same as well. And I remember going on a school trip with her to Llandudno, and she had a teacher called Miss Little, who was her teacher in the final year of school. And Miss Molyneux was the head mistress at Moorfield, and she was 65, so she was just coming up to a retirement. And as we got off the coach in Llandudno, the head mistress, Miss Molyneux, bless her, she was nearly 65, getting a bit frail, fell out of the coach and damaged the knee. So I went back to help, and Miss Little is quite funny. She actually at her and said, "Let David pray with you." So, it was like golden opportunity. So I prayed for her, and she went off to a doctor and got bandaged up. Anyway, 2 weeks later, we were at a school fair, and she sees Anne, and she sees me. She runs up to us excited. She says, "I'm so excited. My knees healed up." This is a 65-year-old, where sometimes it doesn't take us long to get healed. So she was overjoyed. So she connected the prayer and the healing, which was lovely. But what was also nice was coming back on the coach from the Llandudno, Rachel, I was just sitting quietly reading my New Testament on my own, and Rachel was singing this song on the coach, "Holy Spirit, Come Down." I thought, wow, this is my daughter singing this. And I thought, wow. And what was interesting was a few minutes later, after her singing that, one of the lads in her class started to get a bad headache. So I went to see him and asked if he was all right. And I felt led just to ask him, "Would you like me to pray?" So he thought, and he said, "Okay." So I just put my hand on his head for about 30 seconds. And he looked strange. And he said, "Wow, the pain's gone." And so I gave him my New Testament that I had with me, and he started to read it. And then 10 minutes later, I looked round, and it was being passed round about several other people. So I said, "Well, how many of you would like one if I got permission from Miss Little to bring them in through Rachel?" So about 8 or 9 did. So I went to the front of the coach where Miss Little was, and the head mistress, and I said, "Would it be all right?" So she said, "Yeah, that'd be fine." So I took a few in through Rachel. But what Miss Little then said was, "Let's have another prayer for Miss Molyneux." So there I was. The coach was going down towards Cheadle about 60 miles an hour, and I was laying hands on the headmistress's knee. So it was really quite lovely to see how God opened up opportunities. And between 1985 and 1995, I was involved with the Gideons. So I was with other colleagues taking the New Testaments into our local high schools, in Bramhall, in Hazel Grove, in Oriel Bank. And it was a real pleasure to be able to go in and take assemblies like that. But after I left the Gideons, I had opportunities to go in just as a Christian. And I remember once Woods Lane School asking me to go in, and I gave an assembly, and I asked the Lord what I should do, and I spoke from Mark 2 about when the 4 friends brought their friend through the roof to see Jesus, and Jesus forgave them and healed him. And I shared that, and I did 2 morning lessons, and the beginning of this first lesson, this Indian boy in the class came up to me and said, "I've got a pain in my chest." So I looked at the teacher, and it was an RE lesson. And she gave a quiet nod. So I just prayed for him for about 30 seconds. And I said to him, "If you feel anything warm, it's the Holy Spirit." So I prayed for him, and I asked him after I prayed, says, "Did you feel anything warm?" So he said, "No, but the pain's gone." And this big beaming smile came over his face. And one lad at the back of the class said, "What have you done to him?" So I said, "I've not done anything to him. The Holy Spirit's just healed him." And then I went round it. We had them in different groups, and they were doing a different healing, and gave them Bibles. And I had a real freedom that morning. And I just felt really blessed. And the following class was like 2 classes together. And it was like let them ask the questions and I'll answer them. And I was able, whether it was sexuality, healing, or other stuff, and they asked the questions, and I just responded in the way that I felt God was. So God was giving me lots of lovely opportunities. And even when I was unemployed, I couldn't get work straight away. There was an unemployment centre in Stockport, and on the Wednesday afternoon, people could have the opportunity to just talk about whatever their interest was. And when I got there, there was two ladies who were Christians on the staff. And one of them asked me, are you going to listen to this guy on Wednesday? He'd be talking about witchcraft in his family. So I thought, oh. So I popped my head round the door for 2 minutes just to check whether she was right. And she was. She'd done it before. And I thought, Lord, I need to do something, myself. So I went to the person in charge and I said, would you like, these talks, is it possible to do one? So she said, oh yeah. And it was just around Easter time. And I said, could I speak on Christian healing? So I spoke for 45 minutes in a place, there was about 20 came, Christian teacher, and maybe one or two others that might have been Christians, but most of the others weren't. But they came and heard me talk simply about the faith and God's ability to heal. And while I was there, I had another one in as well. And one or two people I was able to talk to and pray with. And I just thought, God's taken me from hearing the Christian message in a school as a 14-and-a-half-year-old, and now 25 years later, or even 15 to 20 years later, I'm taking the Bible into schools. It's like where God touched you as you came to faith, he's then used me in the same way. And I find that God sometimes does that, how God calls you and then he takes you back. And it's been such a privilege. So that was a brief synopsis of the first 25 years as a Christian. So that was starting at 14-and-a-half. And so I was around 40 around this time in the mid-90s. So there's a lot more to share with you. And there's a lot of different experiences in the next 25 years. But I hope that might have helped you and in your faith. So if anyone wants to ask any questions, I'll happy to answer them. But if anyone's got any prayers that we might want to pray with between each other, if you've been lifted in your faith to believe for something, I'm happy to pray, or pray with you. So I'm going to hand back to Laura.